Hello everybody, welcome back to Logos of God. Today, we're here with video number 2 this week. And we're going to be talking about why it is important for, hold on, music's too loud. Okay. We're going to be talking about why we need to change our school education. And why we need to teach more about religious history. Okay. You'll notice that I'm trying something a bit new. I have my, trying to orient myself right here. I have my music player going so that hopefully I don't get copyrighted for playing music in my video. I probably will. I mean, I'm not like I'm making money yet or anything. I have 4 subscribers right now, but it would be nice that when I get big, I'll be able to still listen to music, while I talk. Anyways, let's get down to business, okay? So let me just start out with addressing the problem, right? Because I don't want to just like start yapping, okay? I'm just going to say this. The education system has a lot of problems already. And that's a separate conversation. Right now we're just talking about the way we learn history in American high school. I guess this could apply to middle school, but you really more learn about like complex history of things in middle school. That's when you start learning about ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia and Indus Valley, Egypt, and the likes, right? So, obviously, within the last 30 years, society has been very, very de-religiousified. Right? And now, I have a problem with that, but that's a separate issue. Right? Now, part of the de-religiousification of society means that I don't know how we used to teach history, but I know that now we don't really teach important things about religion in history class. And I'm not just specifically referring to Christianity. I think we should be teaching kids about all religions in a history class. And you definitely learn. I'm not saying you don't learn about religion. I'm just saying the stuff you do learn is very rudimentary, and I don't think it's enough. Okay, basically, what you learn about religion from this is what I learned about religion from school. Class of 2025 graduated this year, so middle school I learned about I learned a little bit about the origins of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism when learning about the Indus Valley. Pretty much other than that, nothing. Skip this. Hold on. Let's play a little something else. And I would say that we didn't really learn much about that. Okay. The other thing we did end up learning about is we learned about two things related to Christianity. Okay, we didn't learn anything about how Christianity was started, right? That's one major problem I have. Second is that the things that we did learn about Christianity were not framed very well. We basically learned we learned about Galileo and how he was persecuted by the Catholic Church, and then we learned about the Protestant Reformation, which if you teach just those two things to kids about the Middle Ages, they're gonna think, oh, Catholic Church was anti-science and then super corrupt, and then Martin Luther came and fixed it all, or some shit like that. And there's some truth to that. But let's be honest here. First of all, I'm not even sure if I'm going Catholic anymore. I was, but I ain't used to. So I would say that I'm in a position of being unbiased to say this. Okay? The Catholic Church built modern Western civilization from the ground up out of the death throes of the Roman Empire. Okay? And they started modern science during medieval scholasticism. You want to talk about achievements of religions when it comes to like making an impact on society. There is nothing that even rivals the Catholic Church. Okay? I might end up going Reformed. Okay? So regardless of whether I do, that will not reduce the respect I have for Catholicism because of that. Right? That's something we should learn about history, right? And if you want to talk about the Protestant Reformations, right? I remember learning about like, you know, Martin Luther and like the Puritans, right? But I understand like why they were important, right? I just learned that they exist, right? I learned about like the Salem witch trials and like, you know, oh, that's why the Puritans were whatever. Okay. But if you really look at the Protestant Reformation, there's a lot of Christian things that we should learn about Protestantism that is so heavily tied to American history. Okay? The biggest thing I can show to exemplify that. Okay? The British called the American Revolution the Presbyterian Revolt. That should tell you everything you need to know about what we should be learning about. Okay? Because guess what? The whole idea of rebelling against a king and not liking monarchy in general comes from that we have here in America comes from Scottish Presbyterians because they didn't like how they were kind of being forced to the Anglicans were trying to force them to conform to an Episcopal church structure and submit to the King of England. Right? They didn't like that. They didn't fuck with that. That's why they left to go to America. So that sentiment of not liking kings and not wanting to submit to a monarchy carried over into America. The way Presbyterians run their government is a two-office system, right? That's because of presbyters, right? That's where the name Presbyterian comes from, right? The Greek word for elder is presbyter, right? So that they have a government, they have a church run entirely out of elders, right? This means that their church structure is almost like representative democracy. The way we in America run our government from literally comes from the way Presbyterians run their church, okay? And the sentiment of rebelling against the kings comes from Presbyterians, specifically from Samuel Rutherford, one of the most important authors of the Westminster Confessions. He was a supralapsarian, and he was adamantly in favor of rebelling against an unjust king. He thought it was biblical, right? Now, I'm not saying all this because I agree with all of this. I probably would never become Presbyterian because I think it's pretty clear from church history that a three-office system is the way that the early church runs it, right? Like we still should learn about this because that's our heritage. That is where these ideas of where American government system comes from. A lot of people just portray it as, oh, this is just what was going around at the time because of the Age of Enlightenment. And sure, that's definitely that was influential on the separation of church and state. Which actually no, now that I think about it, separation of church and state was originally a Presbyterian idea, but it got more and more popular in the Age of Enlightenment because secular people were kind of became a thing, and we were like, oh, well, we should have evidence for what we believe in, and since there's not a lot of evidence for religion, we should not base our governments on it and shit, right? Which, by the way, I don't really like the Age of Enlightenment for that reason. But because, and like, you know, I didn't really understand why Redeem Zoomer would always say, like, America is a Presbyterian country. But if you really look at our history, it is. This is a Presbyterian country, right? Like, this, the American identity is inseparable from the Scottish-Irish culture that we inherited from. It's the popular belief that we inherited our culture from the English, and that's not true. We inherited our culture from the Scottish and the Irish, right? Because they didn't like the Brits. They were like, because the Brits kept trying to force them to submit to their monarchy, and they were like, fuck you guys, we're leaving to America. And then they kept trying to do it while they were in America, so they were like, fuck you, we're rebelling, right? All of this comes from the sentiment that Presbyterians and Congregationalists had against monarchies, right? And now this isn't saying that, like, you know, oh, this is like the most important thing in religious history, but like this is the most important thing to this when you're talking about our country's founding, right? This is specifically a huge part of the American Revolution and how that came to be that we just don't learn about, right? I would say that that's probably the most important element of the American Revolution because it shaped the culture for the next 2 centuries, right? We only have recently, within the last 100 years, started to move away from that fundamentally Protestant culture, right? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I don't know, I wouldn't exactly consider myself a Protestant right now. I might end up considering myself Protestant, but even if I do consider myself Protestant, I'm not necessarily sure that our cultural identity should be based in specifically Protestantism, right? The point I'm trying to illustrate with is that you look at one of the most important events in American history, which is the founding of our country, and there's a huge element that we just don't learn about, okay? We also don't learn anything about medieval scholasticism, right? Because the little that we do learn about the Catholic Church portrays the Catholic Church as corrupt and anti-scientific, which is simply false. That is so far from the truth, and that is a huge problem. We need to take a look at our education system and say, these are a bunch of red flags. We need to fix this shit, right? And again, I think we should be learning about more than just Christianity. We should be learning about all religions, right? We should be learning about Islam, right? Because, like, even though I am very opposed to what Islam believes theologically, and I hate Sharia law, right? You look at, like, things that religions have done for society, and Islam has done its fair share of good things for society, right? During the Crusades, a lot of the reasons why the Crusades get portrayed so negatively, other than the violence, was because Europe was kind of in the Dark Ages while Islam was kind of in its golden age, right? Algebra was discovered during the Islamic Golden Age. There was I can't remember all the things that Islam has contributed during their golden age, but it was a lot. It was a lot. I'm pretty sure actually that's where chess comes from, is from the Islamic golden age. Like, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that might low-key be where chess comes from. But yeah, there was a ton of innovation that happened under the Islamic golden age, and we definitely should learn about that. Right? Yeah, and I would say, as far as like what religions we should learn about in history class, it should mostly be Christianity and Islam, because in terms of making their mark on societies for centuries to come, those are really the only major two. And sure, Buddhism. Maybe this is because I'm uneducated. Buddhism is very, very common in Europe, so maybe I'm uneducated. But as far as I'm aware, Buddhism has not made crazy amounts of impact on the world. I know Hinduism hasn't, for the simple reason that Hinduism is very regionally specific. It really isn't anywhere outside of India and Bangladesh. And I don't know if Buddhism is actually, or sorry, not Buddhism. I don't know if Jainism is even still practiced. And then like, random shit like Zoroastrianism, I don't think is practiced like at all for the most part. We should learn about paganism. Mostly to understand how violent and depraved pagan culture was, because it was bad, right? And speaking of the Crusades, by the way, something I learned from one of my friends recently is one of the reasons that the Crusaders were so violent in the Crusades was because the majority of Crusaders were actually pagan converts, which makes a lot of sense, actually. You look at the expansion rate of the Holy Roman Empire, it kind of was forcing religion on all of Europe, right? Kind of, with like the Scandinavians, like the Nords, and then you look at the Germanic tribes, and you look at like the Celtics, and like you look at their culture, and it's like it's pretty bad. It's pretty fucked up, man. It's pretty violent and disgusting, right? And so the Holy Roman Empire was kind of subjugating those inferior cultures to try and convert them to Christianity, and they were pretty successful, right? And sure, they had a lot of Christians, but then when it was time for a crusade, you had a lot of Christians who were really just a bunch of violent pagan converts who were just, instead of going around raping and murdering in the name of Thor, they were just doing it in the name of Jesus, right? Which, if you think about it, is actually worse, because they're doing it in the name of an actually good religion instead of, Thor commanded that I like rape your youngest daughter or whatever. Like, obviously, paganism is bad and evil, right? But perverting Christianity is worse than that, in my opinion. Anyway, so kind of off topic, but there's so much about religious history that we just don't learn, and we should, right? There's so much about religious history that I don't know, that I want to know, that I wish I was taught in high school, right? I literally just got out of high school this June, right? And I know, I wouldn't say, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on religious history, but I know so much more about religious history now that I have become religious and started studying religion, right? When I was becoming religious, I looked at all the world religions to see which was the true religion. And then obviously I became Christian, right? And I feel like there's so much hate from secular people towards religious people, partially because they just don't understand religion, right? They don't understand, I hear so many people say to me like, oh, why do we need to follow the 10 Commandments? I don't need some religion telling me, like, don't murder, don't steal. That's just common sense. And I'm like, well, first of all, no, it isn't. The only reason why you think it's common sense is because you were born in a society that has been historically Christian for the past, give or take, 1,700 years. So your morality is inherently aligned with Christianity, whether you like it or not. And you look at pre-Christian societies, and this was not common sense at all, right? They would just murder and steal from each other all the time, right? So, no, it's not common sense. Second of all, if you look at the their like internal framework is basically, oh, man-made religion says do this, and they're like, well, I don't need that to tell me not to murder and steal, because like, that's common sense. Like, okay, no shit. Okay, that's because the way that you're framing that is bad, right? So you have to, in order to actually consider it, you have to reframe it as not religion says do XYZ, but God says do XYZ, right? Because all religions are just different beliefs about God, right? And obviously some are more right than others. That's a different conversation, right? But the doctrines of every single religion is just what they think their God says to do, right? So if you look at it like that, it makes a lot more sense than just like my religion says do this versus God says do this. Right? The point I'm trying to illustrate is so many people are so hateful towards religion because they're so uneducated on it. Speaking from personal experience here, back in the day, I was adamantly against religion, and I was super hateful about it actually. And I opened up once I actually started to understand religion, and then I also obviously became religious, right? But it's like once you start educating people, you open up their minds to it, and you get them to not hate religion and religious people, right? Because if they actually if secular people actually understood Christianity, they wouldn't call every single person who is pro-life because of their religious conviction a Christian nationalist. Because that makes no sense and is dumb. Right? And I don't know. I really just wish we would fix our education system, because like it really should not be this hard to like teach our kids the full truth about things, right? And I feel like part of the reason why we don't learn about this is because, our society has become so over secularized that people just want to pretend like religion isn't real, and that like historical events had nothing to do with religion, which if you actually look at history, that is anything but the truth. In reality, what has happened is not that, there are certain people that have over-religiousified everything, but in reality, nothing was ever that religious, which is what secular people claim. But in reality, everything was that religious for all of human history. We just have, over the past 30, 40 years, have almost entirely abandoned religion in our society. And that's not good. Like, whether you are or aren't religious, you should at least see the benefit of having a religious society, right? Because regardless of your belief system, it is beneficial to society. It is inarguable. It is inarguably better for society, right? It is just historical data. Look at the fucking historical data, and it pretty clearly shows that it's beneficial to society. Right? And a lot of people are going to be like, oh, but the Crusades and like the Salem witch trials and stuff. And like, that has nothing, the reason why that's different, okay? The reason why that's different is because the level of violence that was acceptable in the culture at the time allowed for that. Right? And the current society that we live in, that does not have that level of tolerance or violence, right? That's it. And the only reason why they were religiously motivated is because the governments were inherently religious. Okay? And they might say that's a bad thing, right? I don't really have a problem with people thinking that we should have a separation of church and state. I don't really know where I stand on that. Personally, I definitely believe America should have a separation of church and state, just simply because that is a fundamentally American idea. But I don't know if that's ideal. I don't know in the ideal. I know in the ideal, like, post Second Coming world, there's definitely not going to be a separation of church and state. But I don't know if pre Second Coming, an ideal world would have a separation of church and state. You know. And I talked about that a little bit in my political ideologies video. I gave a lot of praise to how monarchies used to work back in the day, because they really were cool, man. They were really based. They have their issues, but so do all governments. Right? And to close off, I would just say that we all need to re-examine how we think about history and how we want history to be taught, right? Because I'm religious, and I would not necessarily say that I want people to learn about religiously biased form of history. I think we should all be learning about a very neutral form of religion. Sorry, a very neutral form version of history. I don't think the way we learn about history now is very neutral, though. It's very secular biased. And people might say that I wouldn't have a problem with it if it was religiously biased, but I've never... I don't know. I would like to see it before I believe it. One of the things, other that's kind of strange about this, all of the textbooks companies are in Texas, and Texas controls all of our I would say a lot of what goes into our learning, because also, like, Texas makes a shit ton of calculators also. So maybe that's where the issues come from. Maybe there's something weird going on in Texas. But yeah, I would encourage everybody to kind of reframe and do their own research about history, simply because the way that the American government teaches history is not very reliable. And I think we need to make it reliable. But until then, do your own research, come to your own conclusions, and don't be a dumbass. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.